Good evening. My name is Jeff Horner, and I am here to discuss Torah portions of Exodus. This is the second broadcast. I am not a scholar. I actually do charitable fundraising for a living, but I am very interested in Torah and in talking to the people at OneShul. It was discussed and decided that this could be fun for everyone. So tonight we are going to begin Va-eira, which is the second portion of Exodus. It means, and I made myself seen. I'll be looking down a lot because I'll be reading a lot. In the previous portion, Shemot, it ends with the Israelites suffering greatly in servitude to Pharaoh. Rather than heed God's instructions to let his slaves go, Pharaoh increases their workload and even refuses to give them straw for the bricks they must make. Moses goes back to God, and in the beginning of this week's Torah portion, God reassures him that the Israelites will indeed be delivered by God's own actions. So the end of last week's Torah portion says, "Then Moses returned to the Lord and said, 'O Lord, why did you bring harm upon this people? Why did you send me? Ever since I came to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has dealt worse with this people, and still you have not delivered your people.' Then the Lord said to Moses, 'You shall soon see what I will do to Pharaoh. He shall let them go because of a great might. Indeed, because of a greater might, he shall drive them from his land.'" That's the end of the last portion. This portion picks up talking about kind of the same thing. And the reason for that is because there was no recording in old days. People sat around campfires and sat in synagogues or sat in homes, and they discussed the Torah portion at length over a period of a week. And so they had to remember, they had to re-discuss things that had been done last week. So it begins. God spoke to Moses and said to him, "I am the Lord. I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai, but I did not make myself known to them by my name, Adonai. I also established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan, the land in which they lived as sojourners. I have now heard the moaning of the Israelites because the Egyptians are holding them in bondage, and I have remembered my covenant. Say therefore to the Israelite people, I am the Lord. I will free you from the labors of the Egyptians and deliver you from their bondage. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm through extraordinary chastisements. And I will take you to be my people, and I will be your God. And you shall know that I, the Lord, am your God, who freed you from the labors of the Egyptians. I will bring you into the land which I swore to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and I will give it to you for a possession, I, the Lord.' But when Moses told this to the Israelites, they would not listen to Moses, their spirits crushed by cruel bondage." A lot of people talk about this. They talk about how this was a new communication from God to Moses. God goes on to reiterate his promise to the patriarchs to give the land of Canaan to their descendants. The commentaries see this divine communication as the continuation of the exchange between God and Moses at the end of the previous parsha. God mentioned his relationship with the patriarchs, and this is interpreted as a rebuke to Moses. "I regret the loss of those who have passed away and are no longer found. Many times I revealed myself to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They did not question my ways, nor did they say, 'What is your name?' You, on the other hand, asked from the start, 'What is your name?' And now you are saying to me, 'You have not saved your people.'" There is a great, wonderful book to read called The Legends of the Jews. And in it, it takes these passages which are open to interpretation and open to more storytelling, because by themselves they're like bones that you want to hang flesh on. And so it goes much further than God spoke to Moses and God said to him, "I am the Lord." I'm going to read some of it to you. "The cruel suffering in which his people were exposed caused Moses to speak to God thus. Now this is someone's interpretation. Okay. I have read the book of Genesis through and found the doom in it pronounced upon the generation of the deluge. It was a just judgment. I found also the punishments decreed against the generation of the confusion of tongues and against the inhabitants of Sodom. These too were just. But why has this nation of Israel done to you that it is oppressed more than any other nation in history? Is it because Abraham said, "Whereby shall I know that I shall inherit the land?" And you did rebuke him for his small faith, saying, "Know that the seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs"? So what this does is it fleshes out a real conversation between Moses and God. Why then are not the descendants of Esau and Ishmael held in bondage too? Are they not likewise the seed of Abraham? But you said, "What concern is it of mine?" Then I ask you, what did you send me here for as your messenger? Your great, exalted, and terrible name is feared in all the earth, yet Pharaoh heard me pronounce it, and he refuses obedience. I know you will redeem Israel in your own good time, and it is of little moment to you now that they are immuring living Israelites in these buildings. Then suddenly, they talk about the heads of their respective clans. That's the next group, okay? The son of Reuben, Israel's firstborn, Enoch and Palu, Herzon, Carmine, and it lists all of these names, okay? Till it gets to Amram. Amram took to wife his father's sister, Jochebed, and she bore him Aaron and Moses, and the span of Amram's life was 137 years. The sons of Izhar, Korah and Niphach and Zichri. Then it goes on to more sons and Aaron's sons. And then it says, it is the same Aaron and Moses to whom the Lord said, "Bring forth the Israelites from the land of Egypt troop by troop." It is they who spoke to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to free the Israelites from the Egyptians. These are the same Moses and Aaron. Well, then it gets to, who is Amram? Amram. Not only did he belong to the tribe of Levi, distinguished for its piety, but by reason of his extraordinary piety, he was prominent even among the pious of the tribe. He was one of the four who were immaculate, untainted by sin, over whom death would have no power, had morality not been decreed against every single human being on account of the fall of the first man and woman. The other three that led the same sinless life were Benjamin, Jesse the father of David, and Chiled the son of David. So now again, we are fleshing out who these people were to make them more human and more understandable. If God was drawn close again to the dwelling place of mortals, it was due to Amram's piety. Originally, the real residence of God was among men. But when Adam committed his sin, she withdrew to heaven, at first to the lowest of the 7 heavens. Then she was banished by Cain's crime, and she retired to the 2nd heaven. The sin of the generation of Enoch removed her still further off men. She took up her abode in the 3rd heaven. Then successfully in the 4th on account of the malefactors in the generation of the deluge, in the 5th during the building of the Tower of Babel and the confusion of tongues, in the 6th by the reason of the wicked Egyptians at the time of Abraham, and finally in the 7th in consequence of the abominations of the inhabitants of Sodom. 7 heavens. Interesting. 7 being the magic number in Judaism. 6 righteous men, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Levi, Kohath, and Amram, drew God back one by one from the 7th heaven to the 1st heaven. And through the 7th righteous man Moses, she was able to descend to earth and abide among men. Amram's sagacity kept pace with his piety and his learning. The Egyptians succeeded in enslaving the Hebrews by seductive promises. At first, they gave them a shekel for every brick they made, tempting them to superhuman efforts by the prospect of earning much money. Later, when the Egyptians forced them to work without wages, they insisted upon having as many bricks as the Hebrew had made when their labor was paid for. But they could demand only a single brick daily from Amram, for he had been the only one whom they had not led astray by their artifice. He had been satisfied with a single shekel daily and had therefore made only one single brick daily, which they had to accept afterward as the measure of his day's work. So now they're fleshing out how the Egyptians made the Jews, the Hebrews, work to make the bricks. As his life partner, Amram chose his aunt Jochebed, who was born the same day with him. She was the daughter of Levi, and she owed her name, Divine Splendor, to the celestial light that radiated from her countenance. She was worthy of being her husband's helpmate, for she was one of the midwives that had imperiled their own lives to rescue the little Hebrew babies, as was discussed in Shemot. The first child of the union between Amram and Jochebed, his wife, was a girl, and the mother called her Miriam, bitterness, for it was at the time of her birth that the Egyptians began to envenom the life of the Hebrews. The second child was a boy called Aaron, which means woe unto this pregnancy, because Pharaoh's instructions to the midwives to kill the male children of the Hebrews was proclaimed during the months before Aaron's birth. We'll go back to chapter 7 of the Torah. The Lord replied to Moses, "See, I place you in the role of God to Pharaoh, with your brother Aaron as your prophet. You shall repeat all that I command you, and your brother Aaron shall speak to Pharaoh, and let the Israelites depart from his land. But I will harden Pharaoh's heart, that I may multiply my signs and marvels in the land of Egypt. When Pharaoh does not heed you, I will lay my hand upon Egypt and deliver my ranks, and my people the Israelites from the land of Egypt with extraordinary chastisements. And the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord, when I stretch my hand over Egypt and bring out the Israelites from their midst." And thus Moses and Aaron did, as the Lord commanded them, so they did. Moses was 80 years old, and Aaron was 83 when they made their demand on Pharaoh. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "When Pharaoh speaks to you and says, 'Produce your marvel,' you shall say to Aaron, 'Take your rod and cast it down before Pharaoh. It shall turn into a serpent.'" So Moses and Aaron came before Pharaoh and did just as the Lord had commanded. Aaron cast down his rod in the presence of Pharaoh and his courtiers, and it turned into a serpent. Then Pharaoh, for his part, summoned the wise men and the sorcerers, and the Egyptian magicians in turn did the same with their spells. Each cast down his rod, and they turned into serpents. But Aaron's rods swallowed their rods. Yet Pharaoh's heart stiffened, and he did not heed them, as the Lord said. This is a very important passage of its time. We all live in a time where monotheism rules. At the time of Moses and Aaron, polytheism rules, and the snake was an extremely important god. So when Aaron made the snake, they understood this was a god, and they could, through their magic, make their own gods. So when Aaron's snake ate their gods, he was proving that his god was stronger than the gods that the Egyptians could put against him. That's a very important thing to understand, because Pharaoh is a god. He's not Yulbrenner. He's not this old guy who's just wondering what Moses is doing. He is a god. He's been raised as a god, and he thinks of himself as a god. And that's very important to understand, because as we'll discuss later, when God brings the plagues, he treats Pharaoh like a god. He treats Pharaoh as an equal, so to speak. He's going to prove to Pharaoh, you may think you're a god, but I'm a better and bigger god than you are. Very important idea. And the Lord said to Moses, Pharaoh is stubborn. Back to the Parsha. 14. And the Lord said to Moses, Pharaoh is stubborn. He refuses to let the people go. Go to Pharaoh in the morning as he is coming out of the water, and station yourself before him at the edge of the Nile, taking with you the rod that turned into a snake, and say to him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, sent me to you to say, let my people go, they may worship me in the wilderness. But you have paid no heed until now. Thus says the Lord, by this you shall know I am the Lord. See, I shall strike the water of the Nile with the rod that is in my hand, and it will be turned into blood. And the fish in the Nile will die. The Nile will stink, so that the Egyptians will find it impossible to drink the water of the Nile. So this is a warning. But it's also important to note that he goes to the Pharaoh in the morning. Why? Because although Pharaoh is a god, he's also a human being, and he goes down to the Nile in the morning to use it as a toilet. But he does it alone, so people would still think he was a god, and they would not see that he was using it. From the infliction of the first plagues until the passing of the last, after which the Egyptians yielded all to Moses and Aaron demanded, there elapsed a whole year. For 12 months is the term set by God for the expiration of sins. The deluge lasted 1 year. Job suffered 1 year. Sinners must endure hell torches for 1 year, and the judgment upon God at the end of time will be executed for the length of 1 year. More explanation of what happened. Moses announced the first plague to Pharaoh one morning when the king was walking by the river's brink. This morning walk enabled him to practice a deception. He called himself a god and pretended that he felt no human needs. To keep up the illusion, he would go to the edge of the river every morning and ease nature there while alone and unobserved. At such a time, it was Moses appearing before him and called out to him, Is there a God that hath human needs? Verily, I am no god, replied Pharaoh. I only pretend to be one before the Egyptians. Then Moses made known to him that God would turn the water into blood if he refused to let Israel go. In the warning, we can discern the difference between God and man. When a mortal harbors the intention to do an injury to an enemy, he lies in wait for the moment when he can strike an unexpected blow. But God is outspoken. He warned Pharaoh and the Egyptians in public whenever a plague was about to descend, and each warning was repeated by Moses for a period of 3 weeks, although the plague itself endured for a single week. So it was a 4-week cycle of the plagues. And there were 10 plagues, 40 weeks. Again, a magic number in Judaism. I want to talk about the plagues in a larger sense right now. God divided the 10 punishments decreed for Egypt into 4 parts. 3 of the plagues he committed to Aaron, 3 to Moses, 1 for the 2 brothers together, and 3 he reserved for himself. Aaron was charged with those that proceeded from the earth and the water, the elements that are composed of more or less solid parts, from which are fashioned all the corporal distinctive entities, while the 3 entrusted to Moses were those that proceeded from the air and the fire, the elements that are most prolific of life. To produce, as Pharaoh would not lay, As Pharaoh would not lay the warning to heart, the plague announced by Moses was let loose upon him and his people. The waters were turned to blood. To produce the plague, Aaron took his rod. Remember, this is Aaron's plague. Aaron took his rod and stretched out his hand over the waters of Egypt. Moses had no part in performing the miracle because God had said to him, the water that watched over your safety when you were exposed in the Nile shall not suffer harm because of you. Aaron had scarcely executed the divine bidding when all the water of Egypt became blood, even such as was kept in vessels of wood and in vessels of stone. The very spittle of an Egyptian turned into blood no sooner had he ejected it from his mouth, and blood dripped also from the idols of Egypt. The transformation of the waters into blood was intended mainly as a punishment for the oppressors, but it was at the same time a source of profit for the oppressed. It gave the Israelites the opportunity of amassing great wealth. The Egyptians paid them large sums for their water, for if an Egyptian and an Israelite drew the water from the same trough, the portion carried off by the Egyptian was bound to be useless. It turned into blood. To be sure, nothing helped the Egyptians in their distress, for although they drank water from the same cup as an Israelite, it turned into blood in their mouths. Now I want to again go back to a larger idea here. That being how God was going to treat Pharaoh. God is sometimes a man of war. And as a king of flesh and blood devises various stratagems against his enemy, so God attacked the Egyptians in various ways. He brought 10 plagues down upon him. This is how war was fought in the time that we're talking about. BC, well into BCE. When a province rises up in rebellion, its sovereign lord, God, first sends his army against it to surround it and cut off the water supply. If the people are contrite, well and good. If not, he brings noisemakers into the field against them. If the people are contrite, well and good. If not, he orders darts to be discharged against them. If the people are contrite, well and good. If not, he orders his legions to assault them. If the people are contrite, well and good. If not, he causes bloodshed and carnage among them. If the people are contrite, well and good. If not, he directs a stream of hot naphtha upon them. If the people are contrite, well and good. If not, he hurls projectiles at them from his ballistas. If the people are contrite, well and good. If not, he has scaling ladders set up against their walls. If the people are contrite, well and good. If not, he casts them into dungeons. If the people are contrite, well and good. If not, he slays their magnates. Now, this is a perfect example of how God delivered the 10 plagues. He treats Pharaoh like a rebellion against him, so that when he's hardening Pharaoh's heart or all this stuff, or why are the Egyptians, why are our, quote, innocent Egyptians being hurt by this? There's a lot of reasons, because this is how war is fought. And God is actually giving Pharaoh some respect here. That's saying, I am going to fight you in a war. This is a war you are going to lose, because I am going to bring all of this against you. I am going to cut off your water. I'm going to bring noisemakers. If you have not heard a whole bunch of frogs in the evening, you know what I mean. Okay? All of these things. Goes further. Thus did God proceed against the Egyptians. First he cut off their water supply by turning their rivers into blood. They refused to let the Israelites go. He sent the noisy, croaking frogs into them. They refused to let the Israelis go. He brought lice against them, which pierced their flesh like darts. They refused to let the Israelis go, and he sent barbarian legions against them, mixed hordes of wild beasts. They refused to let the Israelites go, and he brought slaughter upon them, a very grievous pestilence. They refused to let the Israelites go, and he poured out naphtha on them, burning boils. They refused to let the Israelis go, and he caused his projectiles, the hail, to descend upon them. They refused to let the Israelites go, and he placed scaling ladders against the wall for the locusts, which climbed them like men of war. They refused to let the Israelis go. He cast them into the dungeon of darkness. They refused to let the Israelis go, and he slew their magnates, their firstborn sons. Why did he do all this? Why did he harden hearts? Why did he do this? The plagues that God sent upon the Egyptians corresponded to the deeds that they had perpetrated against the children of Israel. Because they forced the Israelites to draw water for them and also hindered them from the use of their ritual baths, he changed their water into blood. Because they had said to the Israelites, "Go and catch fish for us," he brought frogs up against them, making them swarm in their kneading troughs and their bedchambers and hop around croaking. It was the severest of all the 10 plagues. Because they had said to the Israelites, "Go and sweep and clean our houses, our courtyards, and our streets," he changed the dust of the air into lice, so that the vermin lay piled up in heaps. And when the Egyptians put on fresh garments, they were at once infested with the insects. The fourth plague was an invasion of the land by hordes of all sorts of wild animals: lions, wolves, panthers, bears, and others. They overran the houses of the Egyptians, and when they closed their doors to keep them out, God caused a little animal to come forth from the ground, and it got through the windows and split open the doors, and made way for the bears, panthers, lions, and wolves, which swarmed in and devoured the people, down to the infants in their cradles. If an Egyptian entrusted his 10 children to an Israelite to take a walk with them, a lion would come and snatch away one of the children. A bear would carry off the second, a serpent the third, and so on. And in the end, the Israelite returned home alone. This plague was brought upon them because they were in the habit of bidding the Israelites go and catch the wolves and lions for their circuses. And they sent them on such errands to make them take up their abode in distant deserts, where they would be separated from their wives and could not propagate the race. Then God brought a grievous murrain upon their cattle, because they had pressed the Israelites into their service as shepherds, and assigned remote pasturing places to them to keep them away from their wives. Therefore this plague carried off all the cattle in the flocks that the Israelites were tending. The sixth plague was a boil breaking forth upon man and upon beast. This was the punishment to the Egyptians, because they would say to the children of Israel, "Go and prepare a bath for us unto the delight of our flesh and our bones." Therefore they were doomed to suffer with boils that inflamed their flesh, on account of the itch they could not leave off scratching. When the Egyptians suffered thus, the children of Israel used their baths. Because they had sent the Israelites forth into the field to plow and sow, hail was sent down upon them, and their trees and crops were destroyed. I only go through hail in this because that's the end of this portion. I'll do the others next week, but let's go back to the plagues, the first plague. So, the Nile is turned to blood. The Egyptians can't drink it. The Israelites give them the water for money, and the Egyptians still can't drink it because it turns to blood. However, this plague did not impress Pharaoh as a punishment inflicted in the name of God, because with the help of the angels of destruction, the magicians of Egypt produced the same phenomenon of changing water into blood. Therefore, he did not believe the words of Moses. The next was the plague of frogs. And again, it was Aaron that performed this wonder. He stretched forth his hand with his rod over the rivers and caused the frogs to come up upon the land of Egypt. Moses, whose life had been preserved by the water, was kept from poisoning his Savior with reptiles. At first, only a single frog appeared, but he began to croak, summoning so many companions that the whole land of Egypt swarmed with them. Wherever Egyptians took up his stand, frogs appeared, and in some mysterious way they were able to pierce the hardest of metals, and even the marble palaces of the Egyptian nobles afforded no protection against them. If a frog came close to them, the walls split asunder. "Make way," the frogs would call out of the stone, "that I may do the will of my Creator." And at once the marble showed a rift through which the frogs entered. And then they attacked the Egyptians. In their ardor to fulfill the behest of God, the frogs cast themselves into the red-hot flames of the bake ovens and devoured the bread. That is certainly amazing, because frogs are cold-blooded animals and don't like heat. So they went into the ovens. And what happened to the frogs that went into the ovens? These zealous frogs were not permitted to go unrewarded. When the others were destroyed from Pharaoh and the Egyptian houses at the moment appointed to the last plague, God saved those in the bake ovens alive. The fire had no power to do them any harm. Now, although the Egyptian magicians also brought up frogs upon the land of Egypt through the help of demons, Pharaoh nevertheless declared himself ready to let the people go to sacrifice unto the Lord. The difference between this plague and the first was that the water turned into blood had not caused him any personal inconvenience. While the swarms of frogs inflicted physical suffering, and he gave the promise to Moses to let Israel go in the hope of ridding himself of the pain he experienced. And Moses, in turn, promised to entreat God for him on the following day. It could not be done at once because the 7 days term had not yet elapsed. The prayer offered by Moses on behalf of Pharaoh was granted. All the frogs perished, and their destruction was too swift for them to retire to the water. Consequently, the whole land was filled with the stench from the decaying frogs, for they had been so numerous that every man the Egyptians gathered together 4 heaps of them. Although the frogs had filled all the marketplaces and stables and dwellings, they retreated before the Hebrews as if they had been able to distinguish between the two nations and had known which of them it was proper to abuse and which to treat with consideration. Besides sparing the Hebrews in the land of Egypt, the frogs kept within the limits of the land, in no way treating upon the territory of the neighboring nations. That takes care of much of chapter 8, because in the actual portion, it is again very slim, not a lot of information. And the Lord said to Moses, say to Aaron, again, Aaron's plague, not Moses' plague, hold out your arm with the rod over the rivers, the canals, and the ponds, and bring up the frogs on the land of Egypt. Aaron held out his arm over the waters of Egypt, and the frogs came up and covered the land of Egypt. But the magicians did the same with their spells and brought frogs upon the land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and said, plead with the Lord to remove the frogs from me and my people, and I would let the people go to sacrifice to the Lord. And Moses said to Pharaoh, you may have this triumph over me. For what time shall I plead on behalf of you and your courtiers to your people, that the frogs be cut off from you and your houses to remain only in the Nile? For tomorrow, he replied. Again, it's like hangers to hang bigger stories on. That's what the rest of this is, bigger stories about this. Because this can be read in an hour. When you're sitting around for an evening discussing the Torah passages, you want to have more information. So you think about what they did. What did Pharaoh do? What did Moses do? What did they really say to each other? They did not just have 2 sentences of conversation and walked away. They discussed, and Moses made all these things happen, and they had to happen over a period of time. Moses and Aaron left Pharaoh's presence. Moses and Aaron left Pharaoh's, chapter 8. Moses and Aaron left Pharaoh's presence, and Moses cried out to the Lord in the matter of frogs which he inflicted upon Pharaoh. And the Lord did as Moses asked. The frogs died out in the houses, the courtyards, and the field, and they piled them up in heaps till the land stank. But when Pharaoh saw there was relief, he became stubborn and would not heed them as the Lord had spoken. Now we go to chapter 12. Then the Lord said to Moses, say to Aaron, again, Aaron's plague, hold out your rod and strike the dust of the earth, and it shall turn to lice throughout the land of Egypt. And they did so. Aaron held out his arm with the rod and struck the dust of the earth, and the vermin came upon man and beast. All the dust of the earth turned to lice throughout the land of Egypt. The magicians did the like with their spells to produce lice, but they could not. The vermin remained upon man and beast, and the magicians said to Pharaoh, this is the finger of God. But Pharaoh's heart stiffened, and he would not heed them as the Lord had spoken. Pharaoh is like the wicked that cry to God in their distress, and when their fortunes prosper, slide back into their old impious ways. No sooner had the frogs departed from him, his houses, his servants, and his people, than he hardened his heart again and refused to let Israel go. Thereupon, God sent the plague of lice, the last of those brought upon Egypt through the meditation of Aaron. Moses could have no part in it, for God said, the earth that afforded thee protection when she permitted thee to hide the slain Egyptian shall not suffer through thy hand. The Egyptian magicians, having boasted that they were able to produce the first 2 plagues, An empty boast it was, for they did not bring them about for their enchantments, but only because Moses willed them to do it. God put them to shame with the third plague. They tried in vain to imitate it. The demons could not aid them, for their power is limited to the production of things larger than a barley grain, and lice are smaller. The magicians had to admit this is the finger of God. Their failure put an end once and for all to their attempts to do as Moses did. The Lord said to Moses, back to the portion, chapter 8, number 16. And the Lord said to Moses, early in the morning, present yourself to Pharaoh as he is coming out of the water, and say to him, thus says the Lord, let my people go that they may worship me. For if you do not let my people go, I will let loose swarms of insects against you, and your people and your houses of Egypt and the very ground they stand on shall be filled with swarms of insects. But on that day I will set apart the region of Goshen, where my people dwell, so that no swarms of insects shall be there, and you may know that I, the Lord, am in the midst of the land. And I will make a distinction between my people and your people. Tomorrow this sign shall come to pass. And the Lord did so. Heavy swarms of insects invaded Pharaoh's palace, and the house of his courtiers throughout the country of Egypt was ruined because of the swarms of insects. What's interesting about this portion is that it is the first time that God, in talking to Moses, separates the land of Goshen from the rest of Egypt. On the first three plagues, a lot of commentaries about did the Hebrews suffer, did they not suffer, did the Israelites suffer. On the first plague, the plague of the Nile and blood, the Nile went through Goshen, so yes, the Nile turned to blood in the land of Goshen, because God was showing Pharaoh that there was blood throughout the Nile, that it was not just made in a certain part, that he took the entire Nile, because again, the Nile was a god in Egypt, because the Nile was the life-giving river, because it flooded every year, and that's how they planted crops. So the Nile was a god, and God was showing that he was more powerful than the god of the Nile. So therefore, the Nile was blood. But when the Jews took water, it became water again. When the Egyptians took water, it was blood. The frogs also were all over Egypt and all over Goshen. Again, to show that it was the noisemakers were everywhere. When the Hebrews, the Israelites, walked through them, the frogs parted. But they attacked the Egyptians. The lice would also be everywhere, but again, they would not settle on the Israelites. They would only settle on the Egyptians. The fourth plague has done. The fourth plague was also announced to the king early in the morning by the river's edge. Pharaoh went there regularly, for he was one of the magi who needed water for their enchantments. Moses' daily morning visits were beginning to annoy him, and he left the house early in the hope of circumventing his monitor. But God, who knows the thoughts of man, sent Moses to Pharaoh at the very moment of his going forth. The warning of the plague that was imminent not having any effect upon Pharaoh, God sent the fourth plague upon Egypt. A mixed horde of wild animals, lions, bears, wolves, and panthers, so many birds of prey of different kinds that the light of the sun and the moon was darkened as they circled through the air. These beasts came upon the Egyptians as a punishment for desiring to force the seed of Abraham to amalgamate with other nations. That's a fascinating commentary, because the seed of Abraham to amalgamate with other nations, Moses had already taken a non-Jewish wife and had already had a non-Jewish child. So these commentators, whether they were Middle Ages, early Dark Ages, were trying to say something But they conveniently overlooked the fact that Moses had taken a non-Jewish wife. God retaliated by bringing a mixture upon them that cost them their life. As Pharaoh had been the first of the Egyptians to lay evil plans against the children of Israel, so he was the first upon whom there descended punishment. Into his house the mixed hordes of beasts came first in all, and then into the houses of the rest of the Egyptians. Goshen, the land inhabited by the Israelites, was spared entirely. For God put a division between the two people. It is true the Israelites had committed sins enough to deserve punishment, but the Holy One permitted the Egyptians to act as a ransom for Israel. Again, Pharaoh expressed his willingness to let the children of Israel sacrifice unto their God, but they were to stay in the land to do it, not go outside into the wilderness. Moses pointed out how unbecoming it would be for the Israelites to sacrifice before the very eyes of his people the animals that the Egyptians worshipped as gods. Again, we're talking about all of the gods that the Egyptians worshipped, and God was going after all of those gods. They worshipped the bug, the scarab. They worshipped the sun. They worshipped the snake. They worshipped the cat. They worshipped the bear. They worshipped the vulture. So God was sending their own gods against them. The cessation of the fourth plague was as miraculous as the plague itself. The very animals that had been slain by the Egyptians in self-defense returned to life and departed from the land with the rest. This was ordained to prevent the wicked oppressors from profiting by the punishment, even so much as the value of the hides and the flesh of the dead animals. It had not been so with the useless frogs. They had died on the spot, and their carcasses had remained where they fell. The fifth plague inflicted by God. Let's go to the parish. The Lord said to, chapter 9, the Lord said to Moses, go to Pharaoh and say to him, thus says the Lord of the Hebrews, the God of the Hebrews, let my people go to worship me. For if you refuse to let them go and continue to hold them, then the hand of the Lord will strike your livestock in the fields, the horses, the asses, the camels, the cattle, and the sheep, with a very severe pestilence. But the Lord will make a distinction between the livestock of Israel and the livestock of the Egyptians, so that nothing shall die of all the belongings to the Israelites. The Lord had fixed the time. Tomorrow the Lord will do this thing in the land. And the Lord did so the next day. All the livestock of the Egyptians died, but of the livestock of the Israelites, not a beast died. When Pharaoh inquired, he found that not a head of the livestock of Israel had died. The fifth plague inflicted by God upon the Egyptians was a pestilence, which mowed down the cattle and the beasts. Yet it did not spare men altogether. This pestilence was a distinct plague, but it also accompanied all the other plagues, and the death of many Egyptians was due to it. The Israelites again came off unscathed. Indeed, if an Israelite had a just claim upon a beast held by an Egyptian, it too was spared. And the same good fortune waited upon such cattle as was the common property of Israelites and Egyptians. Let's go to the sixth plague, because this portion only does the first 7. You're going to have to wait till next week to get to the last 3. This reads like a cliffhanger, which it was, because, again, most people were still illiterate. This was an oral tradition for 1,000 years before it was written down. So they knew all about this, but they wanted, the storytellers always want them to come back. So they would hold off part of it until next week. Come back next week and I'll tell you more. Oh, I didn't write the hail. Okay. Then the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, Each of you take handfuls of soot from the kiln, and let Moses throw it toward the sky in the sight of Pharaoh. It shall become a fine dust over the land of Egypt and cause an inflammation breaking out in boils on man and beast throughout the land of Egypt. So they took the soot of the kiln and appeared before Pharaoh. Moses threw it toward the sky, and it caused an inflammation breaking out in boils on man and beast. The magicians were unable to confront Moses because of the inflammation, for the inflammation affected the magicians as well as all the other Egyptians. But the Lord stiffened the heart of Pharaoh, and he would not heed them, just as the Lord had told Moses. The sixth plague, the plague of boils, was produced by Moses and Aaron together in a miraculous way. Each took a handful of ashes of the furnace. Then Moses held the contents of 2 heaps in the hollow of one of his hands and sprinkled the ashes toward heaven. It flew so high that it reached the divine throne. Returning earthward, it scattered over the whole land of Egypt, a space equal to 400 square parsecs. I don't know what that is. The small dust of the ashes produced leprosy upon the skin of the Egyptians, and boils of a particular kind, soft within and dry on top. So it would be itchy, and yet you couldn't take it off. The Pharaoh had wittingly hardened his heart in each of the first 5 plagues and refused to turn from his sinful purpose. God punished him thereafter in such a way that he could not mend his ways if he would. God said, "Even though he should desire to do penance now, I will harden his heart until he pays off the whole of his debt." Pharaoh had observed that whenever he walked on the brink of the Nile, Moses would intercept him. He therefore gave up his morning walk. But God bade Moses seek the king in his palace in the early hours of the day and urge him to repent of his evil ways. Therefore Moses spoke to him as follows in the name of God. "O thou villain, thou think that I cannot destroy thee from the world. Consider, if I had desired it, instead of smiting the cattle, I might have smitten you and your people with the pestilence, and you would have been cut off from the earth. I inflicted the plague only in such a degree as was necessary to show you my power, and that my name may be declared throughout all the earth. But you did not lead off treading my people underfoot. Behold, tomorrow, when the sun passes this point, when Moses made a stroke upon the wall, I will cause a very grievous hail to pour down, such as will be only once more, while I annihilate God with hail, fire, and brimstone." In the portion, it reads this way. Starting at chapter 13. The Lord said to Moses, "Early in the morning present yourself to Pharaoh and say to him, 'Thus say the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, let my people go to worship me. For this time I will send all my plagues upon your person and your courtiers and your people, in order that you may know there is none like me in all the world. I could have stretched forth my hand and stricken you and your people with pestilence, and you would have been effaced from the earth. Nevertheless, I have spared you for this purpose, in order to show you my power, and in order that my fame may resound throughout the world." Why is he doing this? He's doing this to show Pharaoh that they have been fighting, and he is a better God than Pharaoh is. I could have killed you, Pharaoh. I didn't kill you because you being alive are more of a testament to my power than you being dead. You being dead cannot testify to what a God I am and what a better God I am than you. This time tomorrow will rain down a very heavy hail, such as not been in Egypt from the day it was founded until now. Therefore all your livestock and everything you've been in the open brought into shelter, every man and beast, found outside, not having been brought indoors, shall perish when the hail comes down upon them. Those among Pharaoh's courtiers who feared the Lord's word brought their slaves and livestock indoors to safety, but those who paid no regard to the word of the Lord left their slaves and livestock in the open. The Lord said to Moses, "Hold out your arm toward the sky, that hail may fall over all the land of Egypt, upon man and beast, and all the grasses of the fields in the land of Egypt." So Moses held out his rod. Neither now Notice these are Moses' plagues. Moses held out his rod toward the sky, and the Lord said, thunder and hail and fire streamed down to the ground as the Lord rained down hail upon the land of Egypt. The hail was very heavy, fire flashing in the midst of the hail, such as not fallen in the land of Egypt since it had become a nation. Throughout the land of Egypt the hail struck down all that were in the open, both man and beast. The hail also struck down all the grasses of the fields and shattered all the trees of the field. Only in the region of Goshen, where the Israelites were, was there no hail. Fire and water do not go together. The fact that God had put fire inside the water, inside the hail, so that when the hail broke open, fires would cover the land, was just another testament to his power. Thereupon Pharaoh sent for Moses and Aaron and said to them, I stand guilty this time. The Lord is in the right, and I, my people, are in the wrong. Plead with the Lord that there may be an end to God's thunder and hail. I will let you go. You need stay no longer. Moses said to him, As I go out of the city, I shall spread out my hands to the Lord. The thunder will cease and the hail will fall no more, so that you may know that the earth is the Lord's. But I know that you and your courtiers do not yet fear the Lord God. Now the flax and barley were ruined, for the barley was in the ear and the flax was in the bud. But the wheat and the emmer were not hurt, for they ripened late. Leaving Pharaoh, Moses went outside the city and spread out his hands to the Lord. The thunder and the hail ceased, and no rain came pouring down upon the earth. But when Pharaoh saw the rain and the hail and the thunder had ceased, he became stubborn and reverted to his guilty ways, as did his courtiers. So Pharaoh's heart stiffened, and he would not let the Israelites go, just as the Lord had foretold through Moses. That is the end of this portion. In the next portion, we will discuss the locusts, the darkness, and the death of the firstborn. Is there anything else we talk about? That's all for tonight. I want to thank you all so much. I look forward to seeing you next week. Next week it will be Thursday because Rosh Chodesh is Wednesday night, and I will be here on Thursday. Thank you very much. I appreciate your listening.